that is useful around the world, subscribed to by billions potentially of people. So the point, yes, Mark Zuckerberg. So the point I'm making is that if the curriculum design is such that there is an emphasis on skill acquisition, you find that gradually we'll begin to see people who will emerge from those systems, not only employable, but can themselves create jobs.
The curriculum design at what level? Is it going to be at all levels?
At all levels.
Or would you say concentrate more on the particular level?
From the kindergarten level. For instance, talk about citizenship education. We need to make sure that even kids that are not even in primary schools yet ought to know what citizenship is, or to know what their citizenship responsibilities are. We need to make sure that even at those very basic levels, they know that not only do they have rights, they also have responsibilities towards society. They used to call it civic education. I don't know how much of that is done at the very basic levels these days. So, you don't have this sense of commitment, even when you may have it as part of the national policy on education. So I think that what we need to do is to recalibrate our curriculum in such a way that not only do we have it on paper, but it is enforced even at the school levels.
The issue of enforcement, monitoring and enforcement, is, you talked about it earlier, but let's go back again.
Yes.
There was a time when we had the state secondary school management boards. I mean, these boards that are supposed to monitor different things happening in the primary and secondary schools. We have the Universities Commission monitoring what's happening. But it's as though they are, for lack of a better word to use, have they gone comatose? And how do we get to that point where we revamp the monitoring and enforcement arm of the education sector?
It's the same points I made when I was talking about weak regulatory systems. If you see the way schools are established, especially by private practitioners these days, they are not different from kiosks. Frankly, you don't get the sense that there is strong regulatory oversight over how these institutions are established. Anybody can establish a school, open any kind of establishment, and you don't get the sense that there is a monitor. In fact, what sometimes they call that regulatory capture. What happens is that those who ought to regulate a particular sector have been captured, compromised in such a manner that they don't get to exercise.
So even with a good policy
or
law, there's no enforcement, or things just go haphazard.
Yes, because as I said in my earlier intervention, it's not enough simply to say we have a good policy. Of course, we need to recalibrate our policies to make sure that we move with the times. Education is one of the most dynamic sectors, as you know, because it's a knowledge economy, and knowledge keeps changing. So the policy will change. But then when the policy changes, you also need practitioners. You need a host of institutions that regulate how these policies are implemented up to the very basic point. But then you find that even government regulatory bodies, not to mention professional bodies, tend to slacken in their regulatory responsibilities. And so what you have is a free-for-all, not just in the public sector, but even in the private subsector of the educational system. So we need strong regulatory oversight, backed by law, backed by committed set of officials in the education bureaucracy. But you don't, what we tend to see is that lethargy, rather like regulatory lethargy. It hasn't worked yet.
Let's bring in the National Assembly, the lawmaking arm of the government, into this. The education policy last revamped or last visited in 2004, and I stand to be corrected. That's about how many years ago? 2004 till date. How would we go back? Can the National Assembly step in here to see how that can be worked out? Or do we just leave it to the Ministry of Education to see what they can do with it?
You see, the National Assembly can only do what they do at the national levels. But a lot of these populations are scattered in local governments. They are scattered in states. So all these tiers of government, and that was why I said all stakeholders must be on board.
But it's the same policy that runs from up down to the local governments.
Yes, it's the same policy that runs. But then at the level of implementation, you find that all levels of government must be involved. At the local government level, I do not know what local governments do in Nigeria, frankly. They ought to have responsibilities, at least towards primary schools. But what you find is that even their salaries are sometimes paid by federal governments and state governments. So we need to make sure that we rethink our system to ensure that all levels of stakeholders, including state governors, including local government chairmen, all the structures must work, because the federal government may be on the pedestal and we can see exactly what budgetary allocations exist at those levels. But across the 36 states, there are also governmental structures that have a responsibility to enforce whatever national policy of education that we have. But you don't get this exact sense of commitment and urgency to tackle what is clearly a crisis in the sector, and that's what concerns me, because we need to make sure what we have is not just the numbers of those who enroll, but what kind of quality of education is happening? How is the recruitment happening? How many colleges of education do we have to make sure that teacher training rises to international standards? We exactly don't have that. And I think that all stakeholders, not just the federal government, but state and local government should be involved.
And speaking about, vocational studies, because,
Yes.
I know that our public officers, some of them, politicians inclusive, they like to bandy what happens in other climes. Even in our elections, yes, we get some equipment from India, but India has a unique case. Now they want to train over 500 million people by 2015 on vocational studies. And we know how fast they are growing. They have 67% of their population is young people. We know how strong they are in the information technology world. So these are areas that we could also have this comparative advantage. Let's look at compare notes. What are countries doing that we can copy from? But we don't seem to be doing that as well.
We don't seem to be doing that because there's no commitment. There is no recognition of even the importance of vocational education. I'm sure you know about the debates about whether HNDs, for instance, are equivalent to BSc. That is a false debate. That's a false argument. What we should emphasize is quality of education, whatever the degree or whatever certificate you eventually get. But you don't get exactly that sense of recognition of vocational studies here in Nigeria. In fact, if you don't attend universities in Nigeria, you are taken as not being educated at all. So the tendency is for people to gravitate towards those certificates that society appears to recognize. The example about India that you cited can only arise because they don't see any distinction between certificates. What they see is emphasis on certain skill sets. So I think that we should have that kind of similar emphasis on the kind of skills that people have, rather than worry so much about what kind of certificates people have and for what institutions they emerge. We need to make sure that we place a lot of emphasis. In fact, what is important is not just as I keep saying, the quality of education that they have. Ultimately, what sustains a country is not so much the kind of raw materials you have. Since 1958, there has been so much emphasis on the extractive economy, oil and gas. You see, but what in the last analysis will make Nigeria develop is not so much about these natural resources as much as the extent of capacity, human capacity investment that we make. And what we've seen so far does not justify our approach. For instance, although we've been long in the oil and gas sector, we don't even have the quality of manpower to do mere turnaround maintenance of our refineries. So you see that there are graduates of oil and gas, there are graduates of engineering, but we do not have that extensive technical expertise to do basic engineering, turnaround maintenance. We still wait for the Chinese to do this. We still wait for people from Iran to do turnaround maintenance for us. What that tells us since 1958 is that it's one thing to have extensive mineral resources. It's another thing to have the extensive manpower capacity to master the industry. So even in the oil and gas industry, there's a serious deficit of manpower. So that tells us that, look, what is in the last analysis sustainable is not so much the kind of extractive economy that we have, as much as the kind of knowledge economy that we should have, which means massive, dedicated, committed investment in
So the
education.
number of institutions we have is not relevant. As of 2011, we had about 117 universities, and I think there are more right now. We have the petroleum training institutions in Warri, we have in Kaduna, we have specialized institutions, so to speak. So what you're saying is not important, or it's not as important, the number of institutions as regards the products that come out of it.
If you have a lot of institutions, that is a good thing, because in a country where we have 170 million people, the more schools that we have, the more educational penetration you will have across the country. It will improve access. People do not have to leave Kaduna to come to Lagos to study, except they want to do so. So in terms of penetration and access, the number of schools that you have are important. But in the final analysis, what counts is the quality of education you get wherever